Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar series, Restoring the Future, with today's topic, Philanthropy and Unlocking Innovation. I'm Kate Smith, Director of Marketing Communications and the Foundation here at Greening Australia. And I have the pleasure of moderating this important webinar where we'll be exploring the role of philanthropy as a unique enabler in unlocking innovation within the restoration sector. Before we begin, I would like to sincerely acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across this country and pay my respects to their elders and leaders past and present, and to those emerging. I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne and acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of this land. I also extend an acknowledgement and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us on today's webinar. So our guests are dialing in from all around Australia, so please do introduce yourselves in the chat box and acknowledge the country where you're joining from today. When doing so, please select the To Everyone option when posting so that we can see all of your messages. So today, to unpack the opportunities and challenges in how philanthropy can unlock innovation in the restoration sector, we have two special guests with us, our panelists, Michelle Gortan, CEO of the Macdoch Foundation, and Laura Cochrane, Head of Strategic Giving at the NAB Foundation. We'll be running a Q&A with our panelists towards the end of the session, and I invite you to use the chat box to post any questions throughout the discussion, and we'll get to as many as we can in the last 15 minutes. Also, if we do have any journalists on the event today, please identify yourself as such when posing questions. Before we dive into the topic with our panelists, I'd really like to set some context for today's discussion. So launched in 2021, many of you will have heard of the UN Decade of Restoration, setting out a global movement to massively scale up ecosystem restoration as a proven measure to fight the climate crisis and enhance biodiversity, food security, and water supply. The timeframe for this movement is 2030. And this time frame is really critical to us taking action on restoration to mitigate any effects of climate change. Interestingly, from the UN to the most recent IPCC reports, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the resounding message is that we actually have many of the tools that we need and much of the know-how to make an impact on the climate crisis, which really brings us to today's topic of innovation. So if we have the tools available, how can we think smarter and act faster? So we're privileged to have Michelle and Laura join us today to reflect on this. So welcome, Michelle and Laura. Let's get straight into the discussion with an opening question for you both. So first of all, if you could provide a summary over what upcoming trends you've seen in a bit. Oh, apologies. We'll start with you, Laura. How has the philanthropic sector evolved over your career, and what major changes really stand out for you?
Thanks, Kate, and thanks for having me today. I'll first of all just add my acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm also joining from Melbourne today. I acknowledge their ownership of the land and their elders past, present and emerging. So I'm lucky that philanthropy is actually almost my third career. So I feel like in the time that I've been working in philanthropy, the role of a foundation to use all the tools in its toolbox when it comes to impact is growing and increasing. So yes, granting obviously is the traditional tool that a foundation or a philanthropic entity can use to create impact continues to be incredibly important. But a foundation actually needs to think about everything it does and every tool it can use with the capital that it has. And so to really think about how it invests its corpus, how it uses its funds in a responsible way, and also impact investment opportunities as well. So how do you think about where you can have those longer term opportunities, where are those longer term opportunities for impact? And then I think also from particularly a corporate foundation perspective, to think about all the wraparound services that you as a foundation can offer as well. So it's not just money, but it is skills and time and expertise, and really think about all those ways as part of the big impact puzzle.
Great, thank you. And what about yourself, Michelle? What's your experience been?
Thanks, Kate. So I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm sitting, which is the land of the Gadigal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I absolutely agree with Laura, the idea of, how do we bring our whole selves as foundation to work? What are using all the tools at our disposal to bring about impact, and thinking more deeply about particularly our investable assets, where they sit, how they're deployed, and where we're investing is really important. My career has really been in family philanthropy, and I think one of the things that I've really noticed, particularly as we prepare the shift from one generation to the other, is a really different set of priorities sitting from that sort of founder generation to the next generation. And I think that's something as foundation professionals we have to navigate very carefully and sensitively, and intelligently. Actually, there are huge opportunities posed by that kind of intergenerational wealth transfer that we've been hearing about so much. I think a couple of other things that I'd note, the rise of big philanthropy is really changing the landscape. I think we see that most definitely in the US. We see that here in Australia to some degree. And I think, us watching that space and recognizing that, these are huge amounts of capital that can be deployed to bring about really significant change. And how can we do that responsibly and in a well-informed manner, I think is very important. And it really kind of shows us that philanthropy can be the tip of the spear in addressing very significant market failures. And that's a huge opportunity and a responsibility as well. I think another change that I'd note is, we're getting better at understanding the sort of duty of philanthropy to fund in First Nations. And I think while that awareness is growing and the need to do that in a meaningful way, in an authentic way, and in a way that is really culturally safe, I would hope that would be reflected in a kind of growing amount of funding going to First Nations. And I think that's something that disappointingly I haven't been pleasantly surprised about. I think that is something that we really need to think about as a sector. I think given that we're talking about landscape restoration, one of the things that excites me a lot is this, increasing closeness that I see between what we view as traditional conservation or environmental organisations, working more closely with the agricultural centre and really, the agricultural sector, and really exploring what I view as that kind of radical centre of those things coming together, and understanding how productive landscapes and conservation landscapes are not mutually exclusive. There are ways of doing this work to deliver really strong outcomes. And a final point I'd make, I think, is I hope that we're getting better at working in a less siloed way in philanthropy. I think given the scale of the challenges that we need to address, particularly in environment and climate and landscapes, being siloed isn't really going to help us. These are very complex and significant challenges, and we need to view those with a systems lens, rather than I do this bit of funding, I do this bit of the problem. And I think collaboration to address that kind of whole of systems approach is really important, and I hope that trend continues.
Excellent, thank you, Michelle. And you've obviously both got different backgrounds, like you said, with corporate and then family philanthropy. Laura, it would be good to know what excites you about the philanthropic space going forward, because Michelle's obviously covered that. It would be great to hear from yourself from the corporate perspective.
So I think it's touching on what Michelle was saying there. It's about all the different ways and the way that you can collaborate. And I think about the ways that a philanthropic entity can have impact on in different types of granting programs. So both from a large scale, from a small scale, through an innovation through all those ways. And so I think about in terms of what the NAB Foundation has been doing around particularly environment and landscapes, a couple of years ago, we had a big shift in the focus of our foundation, and we were looking at how you can impact across the causes and the outcomes and the impacts of natural disasters. And so what is actually, we thought about how do you get in front of those? So what are the things that we can do that think about the landscapes that need preparing for natural disasters, but then also thinking about obviously the restoration of those post-natural disasters, and what is the big scale of that look like, and what does the small scale of that look like? What is the community-led approach there? What is the scientific-led approach there? And so the exciting thing is figuring out where you can have that, lead that impact, and then where you can work with others to enable more of that impact as well. And so where we landed as a foundation is we have two major granting programs, and one is on that large scale called the Environmental Resilience Fund, and it's through that we've actually worked with Greening Australia and WWF with our inaugural project there. As part of your Climate Ready Restoration Partnership, and I can talk a little bit more about that later if interesting. But then on a small scale, we also have our community grants program, and so that's grants of up to $10,000 for community-led projects that are helping either prepare for or recover from natural disasters. And we've seen some fantastic little projects come through that are really innovative on that small scale level, but which do have the potential to grow and to scale and to really improve that impact more widely as well. So I think it's the broad options that are available for innovation in this space are incredibly exciting.
Apologies, I was on mute. So Michelle, back to you. The Macdoch Foundation has partnered with the National Farmers Federation and others to conduct research and establish the link between enhancing natural capital and farm profitability. It touches on some of the things you've both just talked about with that intersection of collaboration and bringing different groups together. Can you tell us a bit more about that partnership in particular, given the topic today, and the potential of that research to unlock exciting environmental, social, and economic outcomes?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kate. So it's a really special program, I think, because it kind of is an example of how philanthropy can seed and catalyse, I guess, in many what some people would view as a set of sometimes unlikely allies to deliver on a shared agenda. But what's really excited about it is the scale of the work, and I think one of the things that has become increasingly clear, given the urgency that you touched on at the beginning, Kate, and the degradation that we're seeing on landscapes, we've got a really short amount of time, you know, really to kind of make headway in this space. And so I think it's really important that we start thinking about scale. And so this program is really a partnership between philanthropy, industry, NGOs, business, government, trying to address a really fundamental and really critical gap in the knowledge sector. And it is that one that you talked about. What is the relationship between the private farm benefits that farmers derive from drawing on their natural resources? We're trying to understand what is the nature of that relationship in terms of business profitability, levels of risk and resilience to climate change, and variability of production. So it's really addressing all of those economic indicators and measures that are really kind of fundamental in what you probably all have heard about, which are nature-based solutions. You know, nature-based solutions to be delivered to bring about real mitigation and adaptation kind of solutions have to have scale, have to have economic elements, and have to address sort of social inequity. And this program is trying to deliver both. So as a philanthropy, you know, our theory of change in seeding this program was that if we can make visible and quantifiable in financial terms the relationship between natural capital on farm to farm business performance, which are private farm benefits to a farmer, and at the same time build the capacity of producers to understand and be literate and managing their natural capital on farm, we will consequently pull through really significant public benefits. And those public benefits are all those things that we know. It's around restoring landscape, protecting and restoring biodiversity, reducing on-farm emissions, building resilience into farm businesses, whether that be in terms of risk, ability to manage climate shocks. We strengthen regional economies and we shore up our, food and fibre supply. And this work is really based on some small-scale studies that have been done in Australia around the world that have shown that those farmers that are more invested in their natural resources on farm are delivering all of those things. They are more profitable. They may not have the booms of, more conventional systems, but they certainly don't have the troughs. And so there is a smoothing out of those curves. And they are generally more resilient. And so we're trying to do this study across 1,500 farms around Australia, across farm enterprise types, industry types, and mainly focused on family farms who wouldn't normally have the resources to be investing in, gold standard ecological measurement, having farm advisors work closely with them to look at their financial and operational data. And so those farms are 500 to 5,000 hectares. And the work is really, trying to understand that relationship in such an irrefutable manner that farmers and the system around them will trust it. And that's really been, so we've been really designing for addressing those potential objections that may come down the line. So we can say, actually, there is a strong relationship between investing in natural resources on farm and what you're doing for your landscape. The data set that will produce, and there are lots of outputs for this program, and I'm very happy to share lots of resources about it with anyone who's interested. But the key outputs will be basically the most comprehensive data set around natural capital condition that's ever been produced in Australia. I mean, this study will be the largest study of the farm businesses anywhere done in the OECD. But it's going to provide a really important baseline for us to understand what is the current condition of our natural capital on private landscapes. And that baselining will then be able to show at scale, how do we make improvements and what are the levers that we need to pull in the systems? What are the policy settings we need to create to kind of mainstream and embed that desire from farmers in the system to invest in improving natural capital on farm?
It's interesting that you talk about trust and relationship building as part of the research process. And some of the terms that we've touched on, things like net zero, working towards a nature positive future. There's obviously a lot of these terms that and they do change. How do you find that private landholders are responding to that, or is that kind of potentially a barrier sometimes, and it's about finding a different narrative to engage them on?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think the language transformation exercise that has to happen at different, when you're working in with a systems approach, we need to find the language that is right for the target audiences that we're speaking to, and that will not always be the same. And that is certainly the case with farmers. We've got farmers who just say to us, what's natural capital? I don't know what that means. What's ESG? I don't know what that means. TNFD, what's all this stuff people are talking about? And similarly with farmers, the language that they use wouldn't necessarily have the traction with the finance sector. So there is this language transformation that has to happen as part of this work. It comes back to this point around building capability, building the capability of every moving part within the sector to be able to transact more fairly, to be able to transact in a way that kind of really gets to the heart of the issues that we need to address. Because there is this sort of information asymmetry at the moment. We've got what happens on farm that we know with the people who can deliver the change on landscapes, and the system around them, which is bearing down with a whole set of pressures and language and terms and requirements. And those two things are currently not aligning. So we need to do more to sort of create that symmetry and that point of alignment where we are transacting on a fair and equal basis.
Great, thank you. Laura, can you share some, and you've touched on obviously the programme with the Environmental Resilience Programme, but any practical examples of how the Foundation is using philanthropic funding to facilitate innovation to tackle environmental challenges.
Yeah, great. And I will talk about that project, but I do want to just mention a few of the projects that in the past have been funded by the foundation by my predecessors before I was here, that really took what was at the time quite an early view on environmental wellbeing. And so I will just mention some of those projects. We've worked with the Nature Conservancy around recreating and restoring shellfish reefs in Australia. We've worked with Australian Wildlife Conservancy around what is a good joint venture model between not-for-profits and Indigenous organisations to improve conservation and socioeconomic outcomes. And we did some great work with Cochrane as well to support the world's first reef credits, so water quality environmental market, which really encouraged that farmer action, as Michelle's been saying, to protect the Great Barrier Reef. So I will say, do a bit of kudos to the people who were in the NAB Foundation before me to build that knowledge and build that institutional knowledge, and draw on the knowledge that we have within the bank, but also at the same time do some of that educating of the ecosystem, again, as Michelle was saying, because we have many bankers who bank farmers, you know, and need to they speak the farmer language. Oh, that sounds terrible, but they speak that language that farmers want to know, want to hear and want to understand. But we have also the ability to work with them and educate them around climate risks and the need for more nature-based solutions. So it's a long-term project that's been happening at NAB, and it continues to happen. And I think that was obviously one of the factors and one of the considerations that came into why we wanted to work with Greening Australia and WWF on your Climate Ready Restoration Partnership. And what we're doing here is looking at testing green fire breaks to manage natural disaster risks. So green fire breaks are low flammable strips of vegetation that slow down the path of a bushfire. Now, obviously, any project that involves growth of vegetation is long-term, and so that is an important element to us, that the innovation will come, but it's not quick. And so I think it's one thing that philanthropists need to not only be comfortable with themselves, but have their stakeholders and their boards comfortable with, and that's long-term, slow burn risk-taking and proving of different ideas and innovation. And that's what we're doing with this project. So as I said, the project includes the green fire breaks. It's about restoring ecosystems that improve biodiversity in those regions. We're also, as part of the project, engaging with First Nations peoples to assess the feasibility of cultural burning and other Indigenous-led land management processes there. And there's also a great rewilding part of that program as well, to be able to increase landscape resilience and reduce risk for people and nature in the climate. So we're about 18 months into the 3-year project, maybe not even quite 18 months into the 3-year project. And so we're really excited at the results so far, and just really looking forward to what those results is going to start showing us. I'll also, again, as I spoke before about sort of the other end of the scale and this community-led projects. And it's an interesting balance when you think about a small-scale grants program, because the needs of that audience and how you distribute and grant money is so different from the large-scale granting. And so to make the process really easy and accessible, and think about a climate overlay or an Indigenous overlay or an accessibility overlay to all of these grants, you know, is a challenge, but it does mean that you have some great projects come through. And so just to give you some examples there, 3 quick ones. There's a great group called Carbon 8, which is helping, again, Aussie farmers transition to regenerative agriculture, and we gave one of those chapters there just a small grant to run a field day on the New South Wales Central Coast, which is about educating farmers about the tools they have available to capture and store carbon. We've done some work with the Landscape Architecture Foundation of Australia there too. So we gave them some funding to hold a co-design workshop with a town called Uralla in the Northern Tablelands in New South Wales, and that was about getting the whole community together to create an urban greening plan. And finally, we worked with the Rivers and Reef Climate Resilient Alliance, which is actually a group of councils in the far north Queensland, which are thinking about opportunities to create a better pathway to a low carbon future. And we funded a program which was going to be 12 months of education for people in those regions totally. So they're small things, but if you think about the impact in lots of different areas across the country, they do add up to small but big steps at the same time.
Great, thank you. And it's very apparent from both of you how critical partnerships is, you know, in moving this space forward. And I think you talked about traditional granting and just that point that it, you know, it isn't transactional, that a foundation gives out a grant and someone delivers it. It is very much about how you approach it as a partnership to achieve the goals. And with that in mind, it would be great to ask both of you the question, and you've talked about a few things like accessibility, language, factoring in the scale. What are the key ingredients that you think are most important to building these effective partnerships? And we'll go to yourself first, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've got lots of things to say on this. I think you can't work in systems and you can't change systems and you can't work at scale if you're not working in partnership. And I think we have to get really serious about what that means. And that means, as I said before, not the likeliest allies. You know, often the ones who seem like our most unlikely bedfellows are the most potent in terms of delivering the change that we need to see. And I think that, again, leads on to this language issue and narratives and the kind of language that we use and framing of work that speaks to a really diverse range of partners and beneficiaries, that is respectful of those differences, but seeks to find common ground. And so for the work that we do in Farming for the Future, for example, and actually all our work, I mean, I've focused on Farming for the Future today, but we do a lot of work around strategic communications and climate and the like, and some smaller scale sort of capacity building work in agriculture and so forth, and also in climate change solutions. But finding that language that cuts across a diversity of partners to find common ground and to point everyone in the same direction is a role that philanthropy can play. You know, we are a safe convener of those kind of partnerships. And you know, and to Laura's point, it is much more about just the money that you bring to the table. I mean, the money definitely gives you skin in the game. It definitely does mean that you have a voice and an ability to catalyze this sort of work, but it is all of the relationship building, the influencing, the networks, the connections, and that very important thing that we have, that magic power that the work that we do is in the public interest. That is really important, in particularly in sectors like agriculture, which have been traditionally known as spaces where big money moves, there's proprietary interests, there's competing agendas. Philanthropy can play in that space, and make a safe space for all of those partners to come together. And I've been really excited by the willingness of partners from across the spectrum in agriculture to sort of get on board with this project. I mean, I think it's also, you know, of investing the time when you're doing large scale systems work in ensuring that you're not duplicating work, resourcing that mapping of existing programs, looking to draw in existing initiatives to work collaboratively on something that is complementary, aligned, or in some way can mutually benefit each other's programs has been really powerful in this program. In Farming for the Future, we are working deeply with a whole range of initiatives around Australia that were doing elements of this work, which we are either supplementing with additional resource or data to kind of draw it all in. And again, we can get that scale by working really collaboratively with existing within existing initiatives. I mean, I think the other thing we need to do is really work in the spirit of openness and with warmth, and actively engage, as I said, with those people who are not your your most obvious allies. But I will also say that philanthropy, I think it's important for us to work behind the scenes and to kind of lead from behind. The work that we need to do is really about our partners. When we exit a grant or we exit some kind of initiative, we want that to stick, and that means it needs to be owned by the partners within the system who we've worked with. So how do we create that enabling environment that allows us to exit in part or in full, but has really embedded the work in the system through partners, because they have become advocates and owners and, powerful, delivery mechanisms for the kind of change that you wanted to see. So I think they're the kind of things that partnerships initiated by philanthropy can hopefully deliver.
Fantastic, thank you. And Laura, the same question to you, but as we touched on earlier, Indigenous engagement in partnerships is sometimes a challenge as well. So yeah, same question to yourself, but if you have any comments on engaging Indigenous communities also in these partnerships, that would be great to hear from you.
Yeah. I think a couple of things on a broader level, not just on Indigenous, but I think a tool that we have found extremely useful at the outset, or as you're thinking about a partnership, that really creates trust and open communication at the start, is having, well, we call it sort of almost a pre-partnership meeting or strategy session. And I know it feels very practical, but what has come out of those sessions has really paved the way for how a partnership can develop, because it just broadens people's minds about what the other organisation stands for, has the capacity to do, has the willingness to do. And as Michelle said, often if they are unlikely bedfellows, you might be coming in with assumptions that breaking down those at the very start can be incredibly useful for what you're trying to achieve, and also for the good working relationship of that partnership as well. So I think that's a great tool to start with, to really set out what you value in the partnership, what you want to achieve with that partnership together, how you're going to work together, bring up some of the things that you might be concerning you about working with that partner, and for them to work with you, during that journey. And that's been an extremely useful tool for us. I think from an Indigenous perspective, my starting point is listening and learning. I think learning from the people who know this, who know the Indigenous landscape, who know how Indigenous communities want to live, want to work, want to treat their land, is absolutely where I start any of those conversations. We're lucky enough within NAB to have a fantastic Indigenous affairs team, and they are my starting point for this, and a real support through conversation. And so I think listening, open-mindedness, and I suppose a willingness to not rush. It's about taking things slowly, and understanding, what is going to make the most impact. And sometimes that just takes a long time to come to fruition. And even sometimes the idea to be formed can take a long time as well. So it's patience as well, I think, to really listen, do your homework, learn, understand. And then in the process of the funding or the project, continually taking on learnings and trying again or trying something different. So, yeah.
Great. I mean, it's a good point actually about the partnership and those key ingredients, but it is the journey as well. So it isn't just that kind of first getting the partnership set up. There's obviously the whole process after that as well, to factor in those key ingredients. So I think the points that both of you have made really lend itself to that also being such an important piece. Michelle, I might come back to you for a question on major challenges. So what do you think are the major challenges affecting the philanthropic sector over the coming years, and what needs to happen to overcome these?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to focus again on sort of landscapes, given that that's really the subject of this webinar today. I mean, there are loads, but in terms of landscape, I keep coming back to this issue of scale. You know, this is one of the biggest challenges. Something like 2% of philanthropy goes to, you know, climate and environment. Got to do something about that, especially given that we know we need to work at scale. And landscape scale initiatives are going to be really important if we are going to get this job done. And I think we also, and this isn't so much a problem in philanthropy, I think, but it's certainly a problem in the wider system. We need to just stop focusing on carbon. We actually need to view the full suite of natural capital in addressing these problems. Carbon is one element of those, but it's all of the natural resources that are on our landscapes that contribute to restoration, you know, mitigation, and all those outcomes all those goals that we have. And the emissions only focus is getting in the way of us making real progress in this space. We need to get better and very quickly at understanding the relationship between climate and nature, and that nexus, and even agriculture, climate and nature. That for me is one of the biggest challenges, and I am slightly alarmed by the continual focus that I hear, particularly from the business sector and sometimes industry partners around, we've just got to address this emissions problem. These things can't be separated for much longer, if at all. I think we need to be really prepared to work in the mainstream. You know, we can't focus on just the people who are doing the amazing work. If we are really serious about doing this at pace and at scale, the mainstream is where we have to be and invest in shifting the system in that way. And I think, again, that comes back to that point about working with unlikely allies to get change done, to use language that speaks to the mainstream about the kind of change that we want to see. And we just have to be really pragmatic. We have to be pragmatic about what our expectations are around change. We can cry until we're blue in the face about what we're not achieving, but I think every improvement that we can make has got to be seen as a win, and that's what we should be aiming for. A commitment, a deep commitment to improving at every possible part of the system. And I think the final point I'd make, it's just a little bit of a pet interest of the foundation. It's not a pet interest, it's actually a huge interest. We need to get better at understanding the role of livestock in managing landscapes. And I think we are missing a lot of information, and we are not understanding enough around what livestock can do to build soil carbon, to restore landscapes and restore ecosystem functionality. The livestock discussion often gets just hijacked by the methane discussion or the meat discussion, and actually we're completely missing the role of livestock as a conservation and landscape management tool. And I think it's really important that philanthropy lead on this, because it's getting drowned out in the message and in the narrative, and I think it's a huge opportunity for us. I think I'll just say that. Oh, and the final point is, you know, our solutions have to be not just environmental solutions, they have to be economic solutions to environmental problems. We need to understand that the changes that we need to see are equitable, supporting communities, supporting jobs, supporting capacity for them to stick. You know, livelihoods has to be at the center of this work. It's nature and people, not just nature. It's both together.
Thank you. That's some very interesting points, particularly around, as you've said, focusing on solutions and where we are making positive steps, and then you know, sharing those so that others can build on it. And as we were saying about innovation at the beginning, some things have already been that they're in existence, and it's just about how do you leverage or how do you use them differently. And you mentioned about the livestock conversation, and that's definitely a different view than, you're right, you hear in the mainstream. It does get drowned out by the other kind of references that you made. So yeah, I think that perspective is quite interesting. There's an inherent balance in philanthropy, and you've both touched on it with the types of projects and research that you're doing, between taking risks for new discoveries and funding existing solutions for social and environmental challenges. Laura, with this in mind, what measures and mindsets do you think philanthropic organisations can put in place to help find that balance?
Good question. I think that a focus on helping your most important stakeholders be comfortable with the balance that philanthropy can take in this space. So making sure that whether it's your board or whatever structure you have within your funding entity, most which have boards, you know, that your board or your senior stakeholders understand why taking considered risk is the most important thing we can do for the sector, in my view. Now, sometimes to have your stakeholders comfortable with that risk, you also, there is a balance there, and you may need to also fund existing projects to show that scale. But the unique thing that philanthropy can do is test and learn over a long term. You know, we can put money towards things that don't have to have a commercial outcome, which in the world that we work in is really a privileged position to be in, to be able to say, we're going to do this and there doesn't have to be a commercial outcome. And so I think making sure that your board and your stakeholders are really across that and aware of that, and won't question every single step of that journey, but back you in on what you're doing and why you're doing it, is really important. I also think that thinking about the natural disaster space where we work, there's the need for the focus on community innovation, and the voice that community needs to have in better preparing for natural disasters and recovering in the long term is really important as well. So I think philanthropy, the way that we can position the role of philanthropy in giving a voice to those communities to show what works, and that they have greater advocacy, that they have greater ability to influence how they can access funding, how they can take steps with it themselves to be able to prepare for natural disasters is really important as well.
Yeah, two quite different groups of stakeholders there, which is yeah, really interesting to hear. And if I think, you know, there's a lot of groups that do things like innovation grants, and some of those go to communities and corporates, and yeah, bringing your stakeholders, so they're obviously involved in you know, granting some of those some of those funds, and like you say, making sure that they're not kind of checking every single step, and you can actually move forward with those communities, as you used it as an example. So yeah, that was a really great perspective. We're almost at time, so I might just put out one final question to both of you. You've made some really interesting points about that unique role that philanthropy can play in being a powerhouse for social and environmental change. If you as a philanthropist could solve a single global challenge we face today, what would it be and why? We'll go to you first, Michelle.
So I'm biased, but I think Australia has the opportunity to be a global powerhouse in agriculture. We have the landscapes that we have 427 million hectares of land under agricultural management. We have the potential to be a huge carbon sink and you know, a place of hopefully abundant nature. Agriculture has been left out of the discussion, or has been a laggard in the discussions in philanthropy for a while, and I think that's because of what I was saying earlier. You know, it's always been viewed to be the domain of big money, big business. But I think we all know now, given the emissions profile of agriculture, you know, it's the next frontier for us to address, you know, and I think we can deliver a nature positive climate and climate resilient agricultural sector if we can mobilise the investment into large-scale, nationally significant projects that deliver those those economic and environmental solutions, we can restore those landscapes, we can help create those more resilient regional communities, and we can provide a just transition for the ag sector. I mean, I think that's the other thing that we need to think about. We've talked about just transitions in a lot of other sectors. We now have an opportunity to invest in the capacity of producers and their businesses and the system that surrounds them to create a new business model in what we want to be an environmentally positive world. And I think that's it. We have a huge opportunity to do that in Australia. We've got the scale, we've got an industry sector that is huge, and knowing that they have to respond. So I'm really excited about that opportunity.
And over to you, Laura.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, climate change is obviously the biggest issue that we all need to solve. And I think I'm going to pick up on something that Michelle said earlier, and I think that in the work that we do to address climate change and solve it, what can come along with that is the economic solutions. I absolutely agree with what you said before, Michelle. I think that, you know, this is not just about thinking about the nature-based solutions that we can come up with here. It's about the economic solutions and how they work together and how you create a more equitable society at the end of that has the ability to manage a better environment at the same time.
Fantastic. Thank you to you both so much for your contributions and sharing. So that's all we have time for in terms of the discussion, but let's move on to some questions from our guests. So you've already had a number of questions in the chat, so we'll get started on those. The first one is from Peter, and it's for Michelle. Do you see an opportunity for being an umbrella for other smaller family foundations to increase scale and collaborative granting to avoid duplication?
Absolutely, you know, and I think this is the only way it will get done. If philanthropic foundations are pooling resources, pooling time and energy to support large-scale initiatives. You know, no one foundation, including ours, can solve for the problems that we've talked about. It's absolutely critical that we find those opportunities to work closely together, and every bit counts, you know. And I think as a sector, I also sit on the board of the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network, which is an affinity group for environmental funders. And one of the things that we talk about at the board all the time is how can we point funders in the direction where we are all working towards, you know, shared goals and shared outcomes. And that, you know, it is a bit like herding cats, but it is the way to do it. And increasingly, I think, you know, we need to, you know, I was talking before, how do we create those spaces in which we can invite others to work with us, no matter how small or how large. So you know, I completely agree. No matter you know, the power of philanthropy working together is you know, invaluable, and whatever we can do to increase that collaboration and not waste resources and not duplicate is what we all have to work towards. And I think it's our duty as funders to keep communicating openly, to keep sharing information, to have a really kind of, you know, invest the time and energy in those spaces so we can find points of collaboration.
Excellent. And obviously you've mentioned the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network as one of those networks. There are a range of them. And like you said, I think it's about that proactive collaboration so that people actually know what it is you're trying to solve as an organisation and what can we collectively look at doing together. So over to you, Laura. A question from Karen. What do you consider to be the major advantages of the philanthropy sector driving innovation and action, as opposed to other sectors such as government or business, on global issues such as climate change and biodiversity and food loss? Biodiversity loss and food insecurity.
And we'll get off mute. So I think it's what we were saying before, it's that the freedom we have to test and the freedom we have to be able to try new things without having already proven results to secure funding. So it is the knowledge that we can bring together. So because as philanthropists, you know, often in foundations that, you know, they have huge remit of issues and social and environmental projects that they fund. And so a philanthropist within a big corporate, within a big non-corporate foundation are not always experts in the subject matter in which we are funding. But what we do have is that ability to bring in the experts, and as to what Michelle was saying before, and bring them together without any bias, you know, and without any need to please any political agenda. And so what we can do is bring those together, get the experts in the room, and find the opportunities that that can be tested for real impact. And you know, sometimes it won't work. You know, sometimes the projects teach us a lot of things, but don't actually have the impact that we set out to achieve. And that's philanthropy. And so that's the opportunity we have, is to test and to learn and to show what maybe sometimes doesn't work, but also what does work as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because when you're doing that kind of tracking of impact with, say, you've administered a grant, the questions that you get asked are quite interesting, and it might be about what the milestones been on the journey and what hasn't gone to plan and what have you learned from that, as opposed to just, did you achieve this, did you achieve, you know, this outcome that we agreed. Yeah, do you have any comments on that, about I guess how you can better assess that through a partnership? So
I think, you know, having an impact measurement framework with any project is important. And so, you know, and numbers will always be important. So whether you hit a target or not, you know, that will be noted. But I think the role that philanthropy can play in drawing out the conversation and drawing out and sharing the learning, and whether that, you know, can be in simple things like just case studies, you know, and you know, showing vulnerability about what hasn't worked in a case study, and say, you know, we funded this and it didn't work, and that's okay. And I think during a partnership or a granting round, having the open mind chat, having the conversation, which is showing that vulnerability and saying, this didn't work, but you know what, the learning here is this, and this is what we could do differently right now. This is what the next project could do differently in the future. And just, yeah, showing that vulnerability, I think, on both sides is important in those conversations.
Yeah, I think, like you said, creating that safe space, and to a point Michelle made earlier about being quite pragmatic and encouraging that kind of open and honest feedback on that journey as well. So yeah. Question for you, Michelle, from Ella. You mentioned that a relatively low percentage of philanthropic funds currently go to environmental causes. What do you think needs to change to turn the tide of this in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we all wrestle with all the time, particularly at the AGN. You know, I think it comes back to some degree to that point that I was making about the need for philanthropy to sort of start breaking down some of the traditional silos of funding. You know, we only do X or we only do Y. And I think often when we start to view the complexity of the issues, you know, let it be climate change or environmental restoration or whatever, you actually start to realise that those things are far more interrelated or completely interrelated. And so I think whatever we can do to sort of encourage people to, and funders, to view problems more holistically, to actually make them realise, well, if you're interested in health, well, climate is relevant to health. And, you know, if you're interested in urban landscapes, well, you know, the way we manage urban planning and climate, they're all related. And I think it's about how we, again, it's a language problem. I think it's how do we reframe some of these issues? How do we support funders on a kind of journey around understanding the complexity and interrelatedness of what are singularly wicked problems, but actually so deeply related that that you know, we might be missing a trick. And I think yeah, I think as a funder, we use our platform, particularly around at Macdoch Foundation, to keep talking about, you know, it's almost like the more you say it, the more hopefully people will believe it. The nexus between climate and nature is real, and we can do something about it. And the nexus between nature and agriculture, those things are real, and we can do something about it. And sadly, I think it's going to take tipping points. You know, it's going to take tipping points where we go, we've got to do something, and that hopefully will start to move funding. I think the other thing that will happen, and it's something I mentioned earlier, the generational shift that is happening in philanthropy, I think will drive growing investment into climate and nature related philanthropy. So as younger generations come through and their children start to become more literate on these issues, and we know that they are through school, this is becoming part of our everyday discussions, you know, that will change the funding landscape. So I'm hopeful with that, but I just hope it happens sooner rather than later.
I agree what you were saying there, Michelle, about those tipping points, and for the work that we do around natural disasters, you know, the bushfires of late 2019 and early 2020 were a tipping point there. You know, the awareness of the link between climate change and natural disasters, which, you know, science had been telling us for years, but wasn't in the social discourse in the way that it was after that. And I think it also opens up the opportunity to talk about the different type of philanthropy and investment that can be made around things, you know, big things like natural disasters, because even now, despite us having those incredibly big natural disasters, and we continue to have, the huge majority of philanthropy happens at the time of a natural disaster. Whereas what we need to do is shift that philanthropy to preparing. We need to do, the philanthropy and the investment needs to happen when we don't have natural disasters. And so that conversation has started and didn't even really exist before those 2020 bushfires. Unfortunately, it exists now, and it's gathering momentum, but it's slowly and surely, and more tipping points are needed to increase that as well.
I agree. And I think that kind of reflects the discussion. I think I sort of said, you know, the global community and the sort of, you know, United Nations and all of those organizations, you know, in kind of multilateral agreement world around climate change and environment, you know, this idea of funding adaptation strategies, I think, is going to grow. And I think we have funded, as you say, ex post facto, but we now need to really be serious about investing heavily in adaptation, preparedness, and resilience at every point we can find it. And a lot of people, I think, get uncomfortable about that because it means, you know, are we letting people off the hook? But the reality is, and I think you said this at the beginning, we need all the tools in the toolbox at this point. All of the levers around mitigation, adaptation, and the like need to be activated at this point, because the silver bullet does not exist anymore. And we've had confirmation of that through the most recent ICCP report. And it's just the time has come. So adaptation, resilience, and preparedness has got to be funded meaningfully in the coming months and years.
Fantastic. Probably got time for one more question, and Laura, I might put this one to you. A question from Michael: as a small donor and having watched corporate engagement in social giving and the relationship between donors and philanthropic organisations, how captive to or independent from the key donors are such philanthropic organisations in moving forward on the process and outcomes and objectives?
Yeah, so there is no one size fits all. And I mean, I don't think I've yet come across a corporate philanthropic entity that is the same as another one in terms of structure, governance, input from the donor, no input from the donor, you know, it really is completely different. I think it depends on how, on the history of the corporate, it depends on how the foundation or the philanthropic entity was created within that organisation, the intent. It depends on the people who are running the foundation or the philanthropic entity. It depends on the people who are running the organisation. And so I think there is no one answer to that. In some organisations, it will be extremely high, where there is incredible alignment between the philanthropic goals and the commercial goals of the organisation. In other organisations, they won't be anywhere near as close. And so it is an interesting dynamic where you can see different the philanthropic entity and the donor, doing things that on the outside don't look like they marry up. But I think obviously a point where we would want to get to is that we're all, fighting towards the same cause and the same goals, which is around addressing the changes in this particular incidence in climate, but whatever the issue may be, whether it's homelessness or domestic family violence, whatever you're focusing on, the way that you address that problem within the role of the organisation that you're in, whether it's philanthropic or not, is having an impact.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's all we have time for, unfortunately. But thank you so much, Michelle and Laura, as I said, for sharing and your contributions. It's been a great conversation. And thanks to everyone that's joined the event today. If you would like to provide any feedback on the event or connect with the member of our Greening Australia team, please contact the email address that's in the chat box. Thank you, everyone. Bye.